The government spends your hard-earned tax money on a variety of things. If you earn over $90,000 a year in Australia, you may find yourself spending a little bit extra than most. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Reese. Today, I want to give you some information on what the Medicare Levy is and what the Medicare Levy Surcharge is. In Australia, the Medicare Levy helps fund our public health system, known as Medicare. The Medicare Levy is an Australian government tax where you will pay 2% of the income you earn if you are eligible to pay tax to the government. This is in addition to the income tax that you pay. It's essentially a fee for the citizens of Australia to have a public health system. The way you pay the Medicare levy is the same way that you pay tax. An employer will withhold the funds every time you get paid to cover the cost of your own taxes and the actual Medicare levy. So come tax time, you shouldn't have to pay anything at all because it should have already been covered by your employer withholding your money. Personally, I believe that 2% of your wage to cover a countrywide healthcare system is not bad. In America, you hear pretty terrible stories and things about people not being able to pay for their medical bills because they don't have a public healthcare system. I've left a link in the description below to give some insight as to what Medicare actually covers, and then you could make your own determination as to whether or not you think it's a good or bad idea to be paying a 2% tax for a public healthcare system. Like I said, personally, I believe we should probably be paying a little bit more because it's such a great service knowing that you can go to hospital without walking out with a $90,000 bill. So putting the Medicare levy aside, I want to talk about the Medicare Levy Surcharge. This is an additional cost to some people who reside in Australia. In Australia, if your income exceeds a certain threshold, which is currently $90,000, and you do not have an appropriate level of hospital cover, which I will talk about in a minute, you will be required to pay what's called the Medicare Levy Surcharge, which is an additional fee on top of the Medicare levy, which I'll break down based on how much you earn in a minute, but essentially it's an extra fee for you to have to pay the government for our public healthcare system. So to break it down, the Medicare Levy Surcharge is levied on your taxable income. For a single in Australia, it is 0% if you earn less than $90,000 a year. Once you earn over $90,000, you will be charged an additional fee of 1% between $90,000 and $105,000. So if you earn $105,000 in a year, you will be charged 1% of $105,000, that is $1,500. So you will be charged an extra $1,500 come tax time. And it goes up in increments. So 1.25% between $105,000 and $140,000, 1.5% if you earn over $140,000 as a single in Australia. Those are the rates for a single. Now for couples, families, or single parents, it's 0% for a combined income of less than $180,000. That's pretty simple to understand. Two people together, both incomes of 90 and 90 equals 180. That's where they've derived that number from. It's 1% between 180,000 and 210,000, 1.25% between 210,000 and 280,000 combined, and 1.5% for a combined income of over $280,000. If you have two or more dependent children, the family income threshold is increased by $1,500 for each dependent child after the first child. This is important to understand because there are ways to benefit from having to essentially pay a fee. The first time I broke that $90,000 threshold, I had to determine whether or not it was worth finding a way to not have to pay that surcharge because it may have been cheaper or more beneficial to go down a different path. There are ways to avoid paying the Medicare Levy Surcharge, and you should definitely do your research into understanding if it is worth you going down that path to avoid paying it. I'm going to discuss which of the methods that you can take to avoid paying it right now. Starting with the most simplest method that I've already covered is that if you earn less than $90,000 or $180,000 as a couple, you are exempt from paying the surcharge. Great. Moving on. The second way to avoid paying the Medicare Levy Surcharge is to take out an appropriate level of hospital cover. Now, what does that mean? The second way to avoid paying the Medicare Levy Surcharge is to take out an appropriate level of hospital cover. Now, this will generally be cheaper than paying the Medicare Levy Surcharge, especially if you're in the higher income earning brackets. So for $1,200, you could get a basic hospital cover with some extras, which will cover a lot of little things like dental and an ambulance call, for example, which can be really beneficial. And will basically save you a little bit more money on having to pay the Medicare Levy Surcharge. So it's a win-win in a pretty shitty situation where you gain a little bit from your private health and maybe some peace of mind, and you save a little bit of money that you would have had to put towards this bill. Absolutely worth looking into. I suggest you go to any private health company, look at a few, see what their basic hospital covers are that support not having to pay the Medicare Levy Surcharge, and make a decision as to whether it would be a good idea for you to actually take out private health. An extra consideration with private health is that your excess, so we'll talk about insurances in future videos, but your excess is going to have to be less than $750 for singles and less than $1,500 for families. So one thing to consider is that you may have to pay a higher premium for the private health because you can't take out the maximum excess on the insurance policy. But do your research. The process is quite simple and it's pretty easy to understand. Ultimately, if you need to ask questions, all of these private healthcare companies can assist you in that process. Ultimately, those are the two ways to avoid paying the Medicare Levy Surcharge. So if you earn over 90 grand, private healthcare is generally going to be the way to go, which I, for one, was always against, but I've actually used it quite a lot in the past couple of years, and it has benefited me greatly from taking out that cover. So it's something to do your research into, which could still save you money in a situation where you have to spend money regardless. The Medicare Levy Surcharge is charged based on your gross income, meaning before tax income. So if you make $100,000 before tax and only $75,000 after tax, you would be charged the Medicare Levy Surcharge because you're above that $90,000 threshold with your gross income. I know for a fact that this has caught people out before, and it's something definitely to be aware of. Another consideration is that depending on your income and age, you may be eligible for government rebates on private health. This is where the government will put money towards a premium, such as your private health premium, to reduce the cost of it. This is something I benefited from, where I saved about $300 off of the cost of my premium, where I believe the health cover that I was looking for was about $1,500 and my Medicare Levy Surcharge was going to be about $1,500. Through this rebate, I got about $300 back, and it made it cheaper to take out private health than pay the surcharge. Just as an example, the amount is categorized in tiers as seen on the screen, which factor in your age, your marital status, and your income. This can definitely be a nice discount if you are considering taking out private health cover to avoid paying the Medicare Levy Surcharge. Remember that you will be paying the Medicare levy as long as you are earning enough money to be taxed, which is that 2% of your income. You will only be required to pay the Medicare Levy Surcharge, which is the additional fee, once you earn over $90,000 gross income, not net, gross. And that's where you look at determining whether or not private health is for you to avoid paying the Medicare Levy Surcharge, where you might save a little bit more money and get something back from it in the form of private health. I hope this gives some insight as to the difference between the Medicare Levy and the Medicare Levy Surcharge, one being a mandatory thing you have to pay and one being something that can be avoided if you take specific steps to avoid paying it, which could still benefit you greatly. I hope I've given you some information which you can now take away and do some of your own research to determine whether or not you should be taking out private health and what type of options there are out there for you to avoid being slapped with a fee that you won't actually gain anything from. Overall, I hope I gave some insight into what the difference between the Medicare Levy and the Medicare Levy Surcharge is. If you enjoyed today's video or learned something new, please consider liking and subscribing because it really helps the channel, and I will see you in the next one.